I had to laugh in listening to my promo this morning. It was something I put together a couple of years ago when I started this show. And little could I realize in December 2021 how much those three phrases that I mentioned to describe the show, how prescient they are. And we've had quite a week since we were last together. I tend to think that there are a number of individuals in our society who do not feel very much empowered these days. And that the vehicles by which the empowerment can take hold are slowly eroding. And in fact, the reactions we see on the streets are only the symptoms, and clearly do not reflect on the root cause, which is a subject that we tend to avoid at all costs, almost afraid that we would be opening up a Pandora's box, one that we could never close. So best not to talk about it. Let's go to the second phrase that I had in my announcement that showed up sometime around 9:58, 9:59. The community of kinship. We could not be farther away from this concept right now in Austria. And I suspect that this condition can be found at a number of touch points throughout the world right now. And the last part, that social transformation. Something's certainly taking place, but we know from history that there really is no such thing as a revolution. There is clearly an evolution that works at different speeds. And that evolution works very much the way that nature does. It is not a trajectory similar to what Walter Rusto talked about in that plane that takes off, the plane of growth. No, social transformation doesn't work that way, folks. It works like nature. That means that we will make some progress, and then we will have some setbacks, and we might even have more setbacks. But those setbacks will prepare us for the next step forward. And that is where we find ourselves to be right now. And the question is whether we will be ready for additional setbacks Not whether they are going to come or not, but rather whether we are prepared. And of course, what we need to push our energies forward. I've been thinking about this one a lot, that I am not looking forward to 2022. And it has nothing to do with me as an individual. I have no concern. As, like many of you, we've had plenty of experience over the last almost 2 years now of living in our bunkers. So if it's a case of where we need to go spend a little bit more time there, I know I can manage. And in fact, this becomes more and more apparent that that time in the bunker has left emotional scars. Which is really a great segue into what I really wanted to talk about today. And the subject is the energy of convenience. And that truly has been driving a number of our actions. Certainly before March of 2020. But that movement has been turbocharged. Back in the 1950s in the US, there was a gentleman by the name of Robert Solow who tried to figure out where all this growth is coming from in the US economy over the previous 50 years. So he was looking at it primarily from 1900 on to 1950, more or less. And he came to a revelation. That revelation was that he could only account for 13% of the growth, following the traditional model of investment, and from those investments being able to track, well, where does this growth actually come from? And it would make perfect sense that you would want to know whether your investments are actually fostering the growth or not, or maybe it's by chance. You could have saved the investment and would have grown anyways. So Solow was a bit perturbed. He didn't know what to do about the 87% that stayed unaccounted. So he more or less threw it all into one bucket, and he called it technical change, whatever that might mean. And only later, much later in fact, did they come up with this category called energy. So when we talk about energy, or what are we actually referring to? Well, we're talking about fossil fuels. And here are some stats that I'd like to go ahead and share with you that I thought were quite interesting. That 1 gallon, which would be 3.75 liters approximately, equals 47 days of hard human labor. Meaning that if we were, as individuals, trying to produce the same amount of energy, which is to be found within a gallon, then it would take 47 days for us to produce that much energy. And let's stay on that energy train for a little bit. We had a certain change in the way that we were deploying energy up till around the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, perhaps a little bit earlier. And up till that point in time, before we realized the potential of fossil fuels, we truly did rely upon that human labor component. And one could argue, of all the growth that took place up till that point in time, it was based solely on the exploitation of human labor. Now, that exploitation as such, if we dig a little bit deeper, we realize that we're talking about slavery. So what's the point, you might be asking here? There was a point in time where we realized it's much more expedient to use the powers of fossil fuels than to continue with the tried and true to be found within slavery. And it was roughly at that time that we all got religion and said, slavery is bad. And of course, if we look at the societies that perhaps did not jump on the fossil fuel bandwagon as quickly, they were the ones that were trying to hold on to slavery a little bit longer, because they realized that their energy resources would be gone. So let's continue with this evaluation. 1 gallon, 47 days of hard human labor. If we were to take it to the next level, which would be a barrel, that would be 25,000 hours of human labor. If we were to do the math, we'd be looking at 12.5 years at 40 hours per week. So, how does this look in relationship to its use? Well, apparently the American averages about 60 plus barrels of oil a year. And if we were to close the loop and bring it back to the human being to understand the actual capacity, that the human body cannot digest more than 2,500 calories a day, meaning that the actual potential of a human being to produce anything close to that of what we are currently producing under fossil fuels is clearly an illusion. So going back to the 50s, the great mystery of where that 87% of the growth came from. And if we look at these numbers, we clearly understand, or we should start to understand, the magnitude of the predicament that we find ourselves in. And I believe that we do not spend enough time looking at the situation from not just this perspective, but perhaps understanding the gravity of the situation that we're confronted with. Which, of course, means that we have some clear physical constraints. If we were to look at the actual value, the current value of oil and gas in comparison to everything else out there, it's actually quite heartening, because the renewables are at such a small level that if you look at the current diagram, you have to ask yourself the question, how can we possibly ever solve this issue? Well, one thing's for sure, if we continue on the current trajectory of use, then that's going to be near impossible, I would say. So we need to start working on convincing the 99% that we're not talking to about the gravity of this situation. So part of that convincing, of course, apart from the fact that we need to be able to speak in a language that the 99% can understand, which goes, of course, back to the problem that I alluded to start the show to begin with. But we need to make sure that the 99% are not coerced, because coercion doesn't work. And we'll see how it doesn't work in 2022, I'm firmly convinced. But we first need to better understand what are our constraints. And so there was a study that I stumbled across called Hacking Human Nature for Good. And this comes from Dan Airy, who is a professor at Duke University and has put out a number of books about human behavior. And so within this work that he put together, which was also a book, he states that, of course, coming up with climate-friendly behaviors is a tough challenge. And he goes into detail to describe what the actual issue is. And he lists them as 4 different levels, so to speak. The first one he talks about is called friction, meaning that it's always easier to do nothing or to do the wrong thing, because the correction would require some sort of cognitive effort. Either we do not have the time, or we do not have the physical energy to actually do something about it. Now I ask you the question, does that sound familiar? If not, you are not a human being. I would argue that all of us are afflicted with this particular malaise. And so, let's stop the finger pointing. And then there's another problem that Ari talks about, and he refers to understanding actions today and how it would look like in the future. So, for example, if we were to something innate, which we could actually manage or measure better, much more efficiently than something that's a little bit more nebulous. If we were to plant a tree, can we envision what that tree would look like in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 100 years' time? Well, it's basically the same idea. Can we define what benefits our current actions could bring? And of course, for us as human beings, this is a difficult endeavor. We cannot envision what we don't see. And furthermore, we are being bombarded by so many disaster scenarios that will take place that all we could really imagine at this point in time are those disaster scenarios, instead of perhaps if we were all to get together in that community of kinship that I truly strive for, and say as a group, so what is that world we want to see in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 100 years' time? Can we envision it? And I would argue not only is it difficult for us as human beings, but there's plenty for us to overcome. We have to counteract all of those negative images that we're bombarded with daily. So it's not an easy undertaking, I would argue. So let's move to the third step that Ari talks about, that we think about the change that we want to make very often at the wrong time, and they're being influenced by various factors that are almost innate and are really quite normal. And the example that Ari gives in the book, it's very often that we will think about these great philosophical subjects at the times where it's easy enough for us to reflect on them. Case in point, if we're taking a walk in nature, then we think about the beauty of nature, and we feel the sense of urgency to do something about making sure that future generations have the ability to enjoy that of what we can enjoy today. But at the time where we can make the biggest impact, we don't think about these things. So when we are in the supermarket and we need to buy something to eat, very often the first thing that's driving us is that it's a task that really we don't want to perform. Well, perhaps I'm a little bit biased. I have to be honest. It's not one that I enjoy. It's a task that needs to be completed, and that's the extent of it. So you're not by nature in a philosophical state of being at that time. Very possibly, I tried to avoid it, but you might already be hungry. Or you have to take care of individuals that will be hungry very soon. And that means it's part of our duty or chosen obligation. So, saving nature is not what we'll be thinking about at the cash register, nor will we think about much more than getting the task done. And very often we choose the convenience choice simply because we feel that there is no real alternative. And then, of course, there is the tried and true of those individuals who are in denial. Kind of goes back to point number 2. They can't see it, so it's not there. And I had a conversation with somebody not too long ago. That, of course, it's not politically correct to come out and say that you do not believe that climate change is real. So you use euphemisms. And the one that was used in this conversation that I had was, well, I don't know how much nature is actually emitting, and I don't know how much human beings are actually emitting. And with that, it's like picking the Joker card and being able to use that card when it's most convenient. And I don't think this example is unique. I think we find this quite often. And we can call it justification. It's a way to avoid the guilty conscience, perhaps. And let's be honest, we're still concentrating on the symptoms. Just like the turbulence on the street, these are only the effects, but we choose not to think about the cause. So I'm sure this won't surprise you. I think about these things a lot. And this idea of convenience, one could argue the necessity of convenience, which are all based upon choices that we make within our society. We shouldn't forget that. Meaning that we make collective decisions and we make individual decisions. And as we have seen, especially lately, that those two different streams are not necessarily always working in concurrence. Meaning, to put it in the vernacular, they clash. And that takes energy. And it might have different reasons for its manifestation. And we should not forget that nothing happens without a reason. So let me go back to the model that I've been thinking about. If you can imagine a triangle, and at each point of the triangle, we would have certain motivators or perhaps sources of energy, expectations. So within this triangle that I put together, we have convenience as being one of the drivers. And because we are talking about components that have a relationship to each other, we would be talking about the convenience vis-a-vis the other two that I put down, one being effort and the other one being value. And in an ideal state, we would understand the value that is derived from our efforts. And of course, the role that convenience plays in some sort of conscious decision that we make. But of course, digitalization has had a funny way of skewing our viewpoint on a number of these relations. And one can argue that since the inception of the internet and all of the paraphernalia that can be derived from that inception, that it's all been based on this idea of convenience. Convenience is value. Now, we can argue of whether that was induced or self-induced or perhaps a hybrid. But really, that's where we are. Cost has been more or less removed from that equation. Before, it was always tied to whatever the expenditure might be. In other words, well, if it costs you X, is it worth it? Well, that seems to have been removed from the equation for the most part. Because the digitalization has more or less reduced the cost to zero, at least zero for us as consumers. We do not need to talk about the amount of energy that is being consumed in the back end to make that convenience actually happen. Just as a short factoid for all of you right now, that if we look at the sources of where energy is mostly being used, they can be broken down to three major sources. Go from bottom to top with number 3, which would be mining. Mining requires a huge amount of energy. And we should not forget that in this chase towards renewables, or this free energy that we think is going to show up on our doorstep any day here, that will not stop. The amount of mining required, it just means that the materials that we will need to fuel the renewable revolution will be different ones. But we will still need energy to make that happen. And that's a point that we should be talking about much more. But for some reason, that one gets neglected. So that would be number 3, mining. The second one are data centers. Yes, folks, those magical applications that we have are all tapping into resources that are either the second or perhaps even the first source of the use of energy. It's not a coincidence that many of the data centers that are being built are very close to strong sources of energy. In other words, you can go ahead and build a data center close to a hydroelectric plant or perhaps geothermal energy. But it's still requiring energy. And then number 1 is Bitcoin. And we'll see how long. Okay, enough of the digression. Let's go back to the question of convenience. So going back, looking at this correlation of convenience, effort, and value. Convenience is actually time. The time required to get something done. Because efficiency is being drilled into our head every possible moment, that we have an efficiency fixation. As if efficiency is the end-all and be-all in comparison to effectiveness. So we perform actions. Do they actually bring value? Do we ever ask that question? But we should. Do we ever pose the question whether convenience brings true value? Or it just allows us to produce more? And this all has something to do with those figures that I gave you in the beginning of the show, or pretty much in the beginning of the show. And the energy required to complete those tasks that are all driven by this concept of convenience. Do you think it would be possible for us to come up with something that would be maybe under these circumstances counterintuitive? In other words, could we possibly come up with a new model that fosters less convenience, but in a real way, not the way that I see quite often in a number of applications today, that because we're so convenience driven, that if you want it today, it costs you X. If you want it in 2 days' time, it costs you Y. So if you want it quicker, you have to pay. And I do believe that this way of thinking is clearly linked to all of that of what I've mentioned so far. So, can we create solutions that are less convenient? Or are we compelled to rely upon vehicles that become guilt erasers? So we're in this constant chase. And going back to the example of the supermarket, we make a choice due to the pressures that we have at the moment. We needed to make that decision. And then we might go back later on and dwell upon that actual decision, maybe consciously or very possibly subconscious. And you will perhaps lament in thinking that I wish I could have made a better decision at that time. And if you ever think that that is something that never happens to you, I will not believe it. I think that's something that we're all afflicted with. And so for those that can afford it, we invest in those guilt erasers. And those guilt erasers take on different forms, either by giving money to a worthy cause, or perhaps performing some actions that will make you feel less guilty. Or you can say that you've done your part in some fashion. One of them that I run across quite often is tied to cleanups. And I've been involved with some. Apart from the social aspect that's there, you're doing it with other people, and so there's a bonding, a sense of identity tied to the actions that you're performing. And of course, at the end, you might be fortunate to perhaps show some others what they're doing wrong. But I would say that that is a side effect that may or may not come through, but it's certainly not your motivation. Your motivation is to erase the guilt. So, if we were to look at maybe this concept of convenience from different perspectives, I'm going to throw a few concepts out there. And I would ask for all of you to perhaps think a little bit about these ideas. And try to judge for yourself the actual relevance. The first one that I would like to toss in your direction would be called convenience as an external motivator. First off, let me explain this concept of an external motivation and how it relates to the concept of convenience. So an internal motivator would be something that you do for yourself, where you feel that you get some sort of internal satisfaction. And the clearest example I could think of, it would be tied to this concept of autonomy and mastery. Autonomy means I could do it on my own, and mastery means that I learn how to do it better, and I relish in the fact that I am making progress. That would be clearly an internal motivator, and perhaps, certainly from my perspective, the ultimate internal motivator. And an external motivator would be pay the money that you receive for the work that you do, or perhaps the title that you have. These would be external motivators. So to what degree can convenience be an external motivator? And here's my thought, and I wish I could tap into your thought processes and see whether this idea is actually clicking. Convenience is something that we prize, but it's fleeting. In other words, the convenience of yesterday might not necessarily be the convenience of today or tomorrow or the day after. We would be happy enough with a certain turnaround time or we were yesterday, let's say, and perhaps our expectations have grown since yesterday. Might be a bit on the extreme, but you get my point. And who is to say that tomorrow, when I say tomorrow, any day after today, times n, that our expectations would be exponential. In other words, we would expect things to be instantaneous, whereas we would have been happy that we were to have some sort of closure within a day or two. Well, that expectation has gone out the window. Our expectations now is that everything happens immediately. And that's how I kind of came up with this idea of convenience as being an external motivator, because it takes on the same attributes as these other categories I listed. So if you make more money today, you will get a thrill, but it's kind of like a drug. Because tomorrow, that happy feeling will be gone, and you have the necessity to get another jolt. So a pay increase begets the desire for a pay increase tomorrow. And I would argue that applies to this concept of titles as well. And because we look at this as an external motivator, and if we can consider convenience to be a drug, then it becomes a necessity. We cannot live without convenience, because it's all tied to this model that we have. And here I am as guilty as anybody in having the feeling that we continuously need to be occupied, and that time has become more important than money. And my point is that we are paying, we just do not see what we're paying, because there is no direct relationship anymore. And we pay in that use of energy that I alluded to. And we also pay in the creation of waste. Think about it. So you go to that supermarket, and it's so much easier to pick out something that has been pre-prepared. Now, within that pre-preparation, obviously, the contents that you're buying needs to be put together in a way that you can grab it and go. because that is really the convenience element in comparison to perhaps having to make a choice. Which one? And the time required to make that choice, because we do not have time. We are dealing with the chore, and we are obsessed with efficiency. So as soon as we can get something done, that becomes our value. And of course, the problem that we have with this convenience is a necessity, apart from the fact that convenience begets more convenience, as I mentioned. That we have indirect costs that we do not see at the time that we make the decision. So because we don't see them, they don't exist. Think about the model that I talked about more or less in the beginning of the show from Dan Ariely, the hacking human nature for good. Those two conditions, the pain of acting now, it overshadows any benefits you might get later on. And of course, we're not capable of thinking about those benefits because they are not in front of us at the time that we make our decision. And because the convenience has become a drug, we've created this vehicle not too dissimilar to induced consumption that came into existence roughly, I'm going to say 100 years ago. Could be a little bit longer, could be shorter, but roughly around that time, where the industrial powers that were running the show came to the conclusion that basically we had everything we needed. So this was the invention of advertising full throttle. And this whole concept of induced demand. So here I would argue that we have such a thing that I will call induced convenience. That means that you do not need the convenience, but you have been conditioned by this model that gives you the feeling that without the convenience, you are losing value. So, how do we solve this? And of course, there is no easy solution. The first step, I'd like to think, is being able to talk about these things in a way that in conversations that I do not hear, definitely not from the 1% who feel that they are enlightened. But by being able to talk about this condition we find ourselves to be in, this condition that has led us to not only the afflictions that I've been talking about so far in this program, but I see a clear correlation between that and the first impulses that I felt that I needed to talk about today. And the concern I have for 2022 and the inability for us to have conversations that allow us to think. And I would say that's a good start. We want to start somewhere. Why don't we start there? And one thing I can guarantee you is not a solution is by saying, oh, we'll just go ahead and raise the price and then people will make a conscious decision, because there's nothing that fuels inequality more than that type of mentality. And unfortunately, that's one I see quite often from the 1%. And it makes me angry. I'm going to be quick. 2 more concepts before I go here. How about looking at energy as being a common good? That means that energy belongs to everybody. And with that, we make a conscious decision. What about convenience being a common good? And we make sure that we're able to look at convenience from a different perspective. And I'll take these concepts and I'll have another week to let them stroll through my mind. And no doubt I will continue this conversation with you next week.